Hello and welcome to my new role-playing focus How to Play video series. This time it's all about Star Trek Adventures. The game is considered to be not super intuitive rule-wise, so if you already got the book, read through it and came out a little bit confused, don't worry, I've got you covered. Even those who have not picked up the book and consider maybe buying it might find a few good pointers in this video series. This first video gives you a broad overview about some of the main features, some strong elements, some things that might put you off a little, and further videos will go a bit more into detail. To find out if you might at all be interested in the game whatsoever, let's do the same thing as a teenager would do if they try to find out if they're interested in a relationship. Make a list of pros and cons. First, on the pro side, very obvious, if you are a fan of the Star Trek universe, if you are Trekkie, then this will most certainly appeal to you. It is a relatively recent game, time of recording 2017, which means that it uses relatively modern concepts. The developer Modifius Games had a good glance at a bunch of role-playing games before making this one. I'm sure they took quite a number of inspirations here and there. Even though it's relatively new, there's already plenty of material out there. There is a this book I'm talking about is for a campaign starting in the Federation. There is another book for the Klingon Empire. There's even a lower decks campaign book. So if you find yourself really enjoying this game, there is quite a few stuff already out there. And last but not least, there is a very active community. What a surprise! It's a Star Trek game. Which means if you run into questions, or if you're looking for people to play with, you have a really good chance of getting answers, of getting additional players. Last but not least, there is already a native Roll20 implementation, so if you're playing online, that might help you out quite a bit. Now on the con side, the rule set, as I mentioned before, is not the easiest to get into. Not only are the rules at times a little bit complicated, they're also not your standard like D&D type D20 rules. So you might find it a little bit off-putting, especially if you have to teach the rules to players who are more into very simplistic, straightforward rules. There is also something I'm going to go into more detail in this video already, a mix of very different concepts in role-playing games. I wrote down mix of hard and vague rules. Hard rules I consider stuff where you can look up very clearly if X then Y, while vague rules are more open for interpretation, for for having a bit of imagination and creativity. This can help you very much have a really good storytelling experience, but if you have players, or if you have a group that like tables, flowcharts, and rules as written, then this can be a little bit odd to some. And last but not least, on the con side, the way tests are done, the way you roll dice in order to see if you succeed with something, is not very easy to discern in regard of success chances. Compared this to games like D&D Pathfinder, where you roll a d20, that's very easy. After all the calculations are done, the target number is known and the modifications of the roll are clear, you look at what you have to roll on the d20 and realize if it's, let's say, 11 or higher, it's a 50% chance. If it's 19 or higher, then it's only a 10% chance. That is very straightforward. You can do the math in your head. Same goes with games that use the D100 rolls. If you have to roll a 62 or less on a D100, that is a 62% chance. Great, very easy. In this game, not so much. You will get a sense of how likely a roll is going to be. You develop a bit of an intuition here, but it's nothing you will do at first game session in your head to discern if something is easy or not, unfortunately. Alright, those were a bunch of random facts about the game, but what is it all about besides being a role-playing game in the Star Trek universe? Well, what the game tries to do is to give you the experience of being the bridge crew of a starship, explore space, and manage all the fiddly bits of a starship crew, but also allow you to go off ship on away missions to experience these worlds you just found and interact directly with whomever you might meet. A bunch of games already do something like this or try to do something like this. Here the focus is on using basically the same rules for either, just with a different flavor, which is a ambitious move. On the plus side, of course, you don't have two barely connected games glued together, but you have to really find the similarities here. And I think this is the part that already works quite okay. We'll talk about this in detail a little bit later. The other main thing this game tries to do is cooperation. In your average Star Trek episode, you don't have a couple of members of the bridge crew doing their own thing while the ship is attacked, but usually one person does something in order to assist someone else to do something. Someone is scanning a ship for vulnerability so that the tactical officer can shoot at that vulnerability, but first the engineer has to modulate the phases, something along those lines. The game tries to put this into your experience too, not just as the members of the bridge crew, but also during away teams, which is a neat touch in my opinion, because, well, it lets the players play together and not end up in a situation where everyone is playing their own little role-playing game independently of one another. Well, I mentioned the complexity of the rules. Let's talk about that for a moment. If you imagine a spectrum of rule complexity where on the upper end there are games like Rollmaster with all its tables or Pathfinder First Edition, and on the lower end are games like, for instance, Fate or just telling stories to one another, then Star Trek Adventures violently tries to be somewhere in the middle. The game does this by borrowing ideas from both sides of the spectrum, from the lower complexity end. From Fate, it borrows the idea of aspects called traits in Star Trek Adventures and puts them into a more precise rule framework, as you would know from Rollmaster and Pathfinder. Also, when playing Star Trek Adventures, you roll a proper d20 and not whatever the fudge that is. About now you might think, wait a second, is this a video on game development? Are we going to see some flow charts now? Just bear with me for a moment. There is a good reason why I'm bringing this up, because it's not just about complexity of rules, which might impact how easy you can sell something to your game group, how easy it is to teach a game, but also a bit of about the variety of things you actually can do. See, with the not just more complex but also more precise games like Rollmaster and Pathfinder, you have a very precise framework, precise rules, and a very clear language. I said this before: if X, then Y. For instance, in Pathfinder, you might find rules along the line of during combat, as a standard action, you can attack an enemy, roll a d20 with these and that modifiers to try to reach the enemy's armor class. If you succeed, you then roll for damage. Very precise, very clear, you know exactly what to do. The upside is you have a very precise rule set for actions like attack, but the thing is you have to precisely communicate then all of the possible actions, which usually in these kind of systems end up with you having only a very small set of things you can actually do, because they're so complicated to write down. Now, with games like Fate, it's the language is a bit more vague, but it also gives you freedom. It lets you use your imagination to come up with whatever the heck you want your character to do, as long as you come up with an explanation why this might be possible, a reason for you doing this. The upside, as I said, is freedom and variety. The downside is that not everyone is always on the same page, and it might dissolve a bit in discussions. Again, Star Trek Adventures tries to badge itself somewhere in between by giving you some of the more vague descriptors from Fate that should allow you for variety and creativity, but also gives you a framework of very precise, specific actions that you can do and where you don't know exactly how they work. Whether that works for you and your group is a little bit, well, mileage can vary, I'd say. Fortunately enough, the game developers did take this into account, at least to some degree, when you are trying to play a game of Star Trek Adventures and you find yourself a little bit confused by where exactly on this spectrum between choice and precision you are. You have a bunch of knobs and levers where you can adjust the precise position. The downside is you have to understand these mechanics first. You have to understand which things you can change, where you can do house rules, for instance, or where you put the emphasis. And it also helps if you can communicate this to your group, or if you're not the GM, how to have a discussion with your group where you want the game to be more on the side of Rollmaster Pathfinder, or more at the end of the more storyteller kind of games. This can be a little bit time-consuming and tedious, especially since it again will lead to discussion. But if you genuinely are interested in the game, you only are concerned about that your group might dislike either side of the spectrum, or like the extremes of either side, know that you are not exactly bound to specific things, and you can adjust some of the aspects with relatively little work once you understand how to do this. Whether it should be enough on the complexity and precision aspect of the rules, what was pretty much the on the con side. Now let's have a look at something where Star Trek Adventures is actually pretty strong. Let's see how the game uses similar mechanics, or pretty much the same mechanics, for away teams as for bridge crew actions, by looking just at the character sheets and the sheets for ships. A nice thing about Star Trek Adventures is you can create a character relatively swiftly. I mean, I scribbled down this one in a couple of minutes, but even with a bit more care and rules explanation, it should be possible to make a character in about an hour or less than an hour. You can already see a combination of what we mentioned before, precise rules and a bit more vague rules. Stuff that has numbers attached to it is probably rather precise, while the focus is phasors and looking good probably is something I came up with by myself. They're not from a list or anything. So you already see hints of that here on the character sheet. The default character generation uses a life choice mechanic, meaning basically that you go through the early years of your character up to the point where the game starts, reminiscent of the game Traveler, with the big exception you cannot die during the character generation in Star Trek Adventures. What a shame. However, this is a good approach to get a new player interested in their character and give them a good idea about that character when the game starts. You can do a very, very swift character generation where you basically jump directly into the action. Really good for one-shots or for games where you don't, when not everyone already has an idea for their character. Basically just pick a race and a station as tactical or helmsman, for instance, and then you pick a very small number of items. You have to distribute numbers on the attributes. They are fixed numbers. There is no point buy system or rolling dice or anything like this. You do the same with 2 of the disciplines. You just pick 2 disciplines, and you pick a value for your character, and that's it. You can start playing right away. The rest will show up during probably the first session or maybe first 2 sessions. That is done in 50 minutes or less, I'd say. Now, if we compare our character sheet with the stat sheet of a starship, we notice, keep in mind, we have 6 attributes and 6 disciplines describing the hard facts about our character, while our ship is described by 6 systems, 6 departments. What we had, what was called traits on our character, is now called talents, and well, yeah, we have attacks and scale on top of this. This is really nice. This helps us using very similar mechanics for characters as we use for ships. We don't have to learn 2 sets of rules, but it also gives us enough aspects, enough things to differentiate your Akira class starship from a Galaxy class starship, or from a Klingon bird of prey, or, well, of course, from a Romulan bird of prey. You can not only look up all of those ships' specific attributes, you can also easily make up your own ships, which is really nice, especially if you if you play a campaign not as Federation officers, but maybe you are going to play a group of scavengers or smugglers. But also, if you do play as a member of one of the big factions, you might heavily rely on shuttlecrafts, which, I mean, the base ones you can just look up, but you can also easily make up your own special type of shuttles, like the Delta Flyer. Now that is already it for this first video. I hope this gave you a first impression of the game, helped you decide whether you might be interested or not. In the further videos I will go a little bit closer onto details. Especially I'm going to talk about the base rules, how to roll dice, how to determine whether you are successful or not on a task. I'll talk a little bit more about character generation, but also very important traits which feel maybe to some a bit tacked on. As I said, that is the equivalent of aspects from Fate. There will be a bit more stuff, things I'm not quite aware of right now, and I will do a general discussion on the last video, talking about whether I think these combination of rules and these specific rules work out well, or if there are some issues here and there. I hope I could convince you to give this game a try, because I think it's quite interesting. At least it probably is going to be fun if you're into the Star Trek universe, especially, or if you're interested in the idea of playing a starship crew that commands a ship but also does stuff in sort of a away team situation. And I do hope you have a nice day, and will check out my next videos. Thank you very much. Goodbye.